I woke up from a 14-day coma to discover that my own brother had sold my $40 million company out from under me using a power of attorney bearing my signature, a signature supposedly written by my hand on a day when machines were breathing for me and a tube was taped down my throat. My parents had signed sworn statements claiming I sat up in my hospital bed, perfectly lucid, and begged my brother to handle my affairs. The man who bought my life's work for pennies visited my room with a fruit basket and told me to enjoy my retirement. They all believed an unconscious man makes the perfect witness, because he sees nothing and remembers nothing. They had no idea that the intensive care unit camera mounted above my bed had recorded every minute of those 14 days, that my medication chart logged my sedation down to the milligram, and that the loyal woman they fired on day 6 had already walked into the district attorney's office carrying copies of everything. Before I share the painful details of my story, I have a quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from right now, and what time is it over there? Drop it in the comments below. I absolutely love seeing where my global family is tuning in from. It gives me so much strength. Go ahead and type your city and your time right now, because what you are about to hear next will completely shock you. My name is Marcus. I am 38 years old, and I built one of the largest independent freight companies in Colorado, starting with nothing but a used box truck and a back that never learned how to quit. But to understand what my family did to me, you first have to understand the house I grew up in, because in that house there were two kinds of sons. There was my younger brother Trevor, the charming one, the funny one, the one my father called a born businessman because he could talk anyone into anything. And there was me, the quiet one, the stubborn one, the boy my father once described to a neighbor, while I stood 10 feet away, as good with his hands, which in our family was a polite way of saying not good for much else. Trevor never finished anything in his life, and my parents never made him. He dropped out of 2 colleges. He burned through a landscaping business, a nightclub investment, and a cryptocurrency scheme, and every single failure was reframed at our dinner table as bad luck, bad timing, or bad partners. Meanwhile, I started loading trucks at a freight warehouse at 19, working the overnight dock in the Denver cold while studying logistics manuals on my lunch breaks. At 23, I emptied my savings and bought one battered box truck with a slipping clutch and a passenger door that only opened from the inside. I named my little company Iron Line because my grandfather used to say that a man's word should run through him like a line of iron. I was the driver, the dispatcher, the mechanic, and the accountant. I slept in that truck more nights than I can count. 15 years later, Iron Line Freight ran more than 200 trucks across 11 states. We employed over 300 people, hauled freight for some of the biggest retailers in the country, and the last independent valuation put the company at roughly $40 million. I owned 85% of it. The other 15% belonged to a man named Glenn, an early investor who had loaned me money for my first 3 rigs, back when no bank would look at me. I repaid that loan many times over, but Glenn never stopped believing the company was really his, that my sweat had simply been managing his genius. Twice over the years, he tried to buy control from me, and twice I refused, and each refusal added another layer of frost to his smile. Remember, Glenn, remember the frost. 2 more people matter in this story, and I need you to hold them in your heart. The first is Elena. I hired Elena as a night dispatcher when she was a single mother working 2 jobs, and within a year she was out organizing people twice her age. When she told me she had once dreamed of law school, I paid her tuition out of my own pocket. And 7 years later, she became Iron Line's general counsel, the guardian of every contract we ever signed. The second is Jenna, a schoolteacher with paint on her hands and absolutely no interest in trucks, who somehow became the love of my life. We got engaged last spring. We were planning an autumn wedding. My parents met the news with all the warmth of a tax audit, and my mother asked, in front of Jenna, whether a prenup was really enough protection for the family business. The family business. a business no one in my family had driven a single mile for. And here I have to confess my weakness, the same weakness you have heard in every story like mine. I kept paying. I paid off the remaining mortgage on my parents' house, telling myself it was gratitude. I bought a condo downtown and let Trevor live in it rent-free between his failures, telling myself it was kindness. When Trevor crashed one of my rigs years ago after I gave him a job he showed up to 11 times in 2 months, I covered the damage and let him quit with dignity instead of firing him with cause. When my parents hinted, then asked, then demanded that I make Trevor a partner in Iron Line, I refused, and my father did not speak to me for a season. I thought my generosity was building a bridge. I was actually stockpiling their resentment, and all that resentment was waiting patiently for one rainy night in March. It came on a Tuesday. I was driving home from our Pueblo terminal in a hard, freezing rain when a pickup hydroplaned across the median on the interstate. I remember headlights where headlights should never be. I remember the steering wheel jumping in my hands, and then I remember nothing for 14 days. The crash collapsed my lung, fractured my skull, and swelled my brain badly enough that the surgeons placed me in a medically induced coma and parked me in the intensive care unit of a Denver hospital with a machine doing my breathing and a monitor doing my remembering. What happened in the world while I was gone, I had to reconstruct afterward from documents, testimony, and that blessed ceiling camera. So let me lay it out for you the way the prosecutors eventually laid it out for a jury. On day 1, my parents arrived at the hospital and, as my legal next of kin, took command of everything. Their first official act as my guardians was not medical. It was social. They informed the nursing staff that Jenna, my fiancée, the woman whose name I would have written on every form if I could have held a pen, was not family, and they had her visitation restricted. For 2 weeks, the woman I love sat in a parking garage across the street from my hospital because my mother told the charge nurse that an emotional girlfriend would disturb my recovery. On day 3, Trevor had lunch with Glenn. To this day, neither man admits who called whom, but the restaurant receipt entered into evidence shows 2 steaks, 1 bottle of wine, and a tip generous enough to be memorable. By the end of that lunch, the plan existed. Glenn wanted Iron Line. Trevor wanted money, and I believe something darker and older than money. He wanted to finally beat me at something. On day 4, a durable power of attorney appeared in the world. It named Trevor as my attorney, in fact, with full authority over my business holdings. It carried a signature that looked like mine the way a wax figure looks like a man. It was notarized by a man named Roy, a golfing buddy of Glenn's whose notary stamp had apparently developed the magical ability to witness signatures it never saw. And the document was dated that very day, day 4 of my coma, supported by a story my parents would later repeat under oath in sworn affidavits. The story went like this. On the evening of day 4, I woke from my coma, clear-eyed and calm. I recognized everyone. I expressed concern for the company. I asked for my brother, requested the document, signed it on a hospital tray table, and then peacefully drifted back into unconsciousness. My mother described the scene in her affidavit as a miracle moment. She even added a detail for flavor, telling the lawyers that I had smiled at Trevor and said the words, "Take care of Iron Line, little brother." I will let the medical record answer her. At the alleged hour of my miracle moment, the intensive care log shows my sedation running at full depth, a breathing tube in my throat that made speech physically impossible, and a nurse performing checks who charted me as unresponsive 11 minutes before the supposed signing. And mounted in the ceiling corner of Intensive Care Room 12, recording around the clock as a standard safety measure, a camera kept its small, unblinking eye on a man who did not move, did not wake, and certainly did not smile, for 14 straight days. On day 5, armed with the forged power of attorney, Trevor signed a purchase agreement selling my entire 85% stake in Iron Line Freight to a holding company controlled by Glenn. The price for a stake worth more than $34 million was $11 million, payable in wire transfers, roughly a third of its true value, structured for speed instead of scrutiny. Trevor's personal fee for signing away his brother's life was $3 million, and buried in the closing documents, investigators later found a wire of $500,000 to my parents, labeled with breathtaking arrogance as a family gift. On day 6, the scheme met the one person none of them had bothered to plan for: Elena. Glenn's lawyers marched into Iron Line headquarters with the signed agreement and demanded that our general counsel certify the share transfer and update the corporate records. Elena read the power of attorney once, then read it again, and then did 3 things in the next 4 hours that saved my life's work. First, she stalled, citing a provision I had insisted on years earlier, requiring any transfer of controlling shares to be witnessed by company counsel and preceded by written notice to the board, a provision this sale had ignored completely. Second, she quietly copied the entire transaction file, every document, every signature page, every wire instruction. And third, when Glenn personally called her that afternoon, informed her that ownership had changed, and fired her for obstruction, she packed her box, walked straight out of our building, and drove without stopping to the office of the district attorney. On day 7, while I lay unconscious, Trevor took delivery of a bright orange Italian sports car. He posted a photograph of it online with a caption about hard work finally paying off. The prosecutors would later display that photograph in court on a screen 6 feet tall, and I watched 12 jurors stare at it the way you stare at a car crash, which felt fitting, all things considered. And on day 14, in the gray light of an April morning, I opened my eyes. Waking from a coma is not like the movies. There is no gasp, no sudden clarity. There is fog and pain and a slow assembling of the world piece by piece. It took a day before I could hold a thought, 2 before I could hold a conversation. And I want you to picture the scene as my mind came back online. My mother weeping with joy at my bedside. My father gripping my hand and calling me his fighter. Trevor leaning against the window with red-rimmed eyes, telling me he had been worried sick. For one fragile, beautiful morning, I believed I had woken into a family that loved me. The performance was flawless. It lasted until the afternoon of my second conscious day, when a nurse, making conversation, mentioned how nice it was that my brother had been able to handle all my business affairs while I slept. I asked Trevor what she meant, and I watched my brother exchange a glance with my father, take a breath, and begin a speech that I could tell had been rehearsed. He explained, gently, as if to a child, that the doctors had been unsure I would ever wake, that the company had needed a steady hand, that an incredible opportunity had come along, and that Glenn, good old Glenn, had stepped up to protect everything I built. He said the deal was done, the money was safe, and now I could finally rest, really rest, for the first time in my life. My mother stroked my arm and said that everything had worked out for the best, and that what was done was done. My father said, and I will never forget the words as long as I live, that Trevor had finally gotten his fair share, and that I should not wake up from a miracle just to tear this family apart over a business. A fair share. Of a company he never drove a mile for, never loaded a pallet for, never lost a night of sleep for. I lay there with a fractured skull, listening to my family explain my own robbery to me as an act of love, and I felt something I had carried for 38 years quietly die. It did not hurt. That is the strange part. It felt like setting down a weight. The next morning, Glenn himself appeared in my doorway, holding a fruit basket wrapped in yellow cellophane. He set it on my table, patted my foot through the blanket like I was a horse he had just purchased, and told me, with that frost smile at full winter, that there were no hard feelings, that business was business, and that I should take the money, marry that sweet girl of mine, and enjoy my retirement. He was halfway out the door when he paused, turned, and added one more sentence. He said that honestly, Marcus, the company was always a little too big for you anyway. He should not have said that. Not because it made me angry, although it did. He should not have said it because it was the moment my recovery acquired a purpose, and a man recovering with a purpose is a dangerous thing to leave alive in a hospital bed. That afternoon, Jenna finally got past the visitation wall my parents had built, and she did not come alone. She walked in holding the hand of Elena, who was carrying a banker's box and wearing the expression of a woman who has been waiting 2 weeks to fire a cannon. They closed the door, and Elena laid it all out on my blanket like a battle map. The forged power of attorney, the impossible date, the ignored bylaws, the wire transfers, including the $500,000 family gift, and then she told me about her trip to the district attorney on day 6, about the investigators already pulling records, and about the one piece of evidence that would turn the whole case from a swearing contest into an execution. She had learned, from a sympathetic charge nurse, that the intensive care unit cameras retained their footage for 90 days. The alleged miracle moment, my supposed lucid awakening and bedside signature, had happened on camera. Or rather, it had not happened on camera. I listened to all of it without saying a word. Then I asked Elena 2 questions. The first was whether she would come back to Iron Line as general counsel and never leave again. She said yes before I finished the sentence. The second was whether the district attorney was the kind of person who blinked. Elena smiled for the first time that day and said that the district attorney had watched the camera footage side by side with my mother's affidavit and had used a word that lawyers almost never use out loud. The word was slam dunk. What followed over the next several months was not revenge. I want to be precise about that. Revenge is emotional. This was arithmetic. The civil case came first, and it was over almost before it began. A judge reviewed the camera footage, the sedation logs, and the nurse's charting, placed them next to the power of attorney's date, and declared the document a forgery and the sale void from the very first second of its existence. Iron Line came home to me in a hearing that lasted under an hour. Glenn's $11 million was unwound, except for the portions Trevor had already converted into an orange sports car and a string of settled gambling debts, which became the subject of seizure orders. The car was towed from the condo I owned, the condo Trevor was living in rent-free, on the same morning my property manager delivered his eviction notice. I did not attend either event, but I am told the neighbors did. Then came the criminal cases, and the dominoes went down in order of size. Roy the notary, facing the small problem of having certified a signature that a hospital camera proved he never witnessed, surrendered his commission and accepted a plea that included testifying against everyone above him. His testimony put the lunch, the plan, and the paperwork squarely on Trevor and Glenn. Trevor was convicted of forgery, identity fraud, and grand theft. He received 7 years in state prison, and the judge, sentencing him, observed that in 20 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a defendant steal from a victim so completely incapable of defending himself. Glenn, as the architect and the money, was convicted of conspiracy and wire fraud. He received 9 years in federal custody, a judgment that stripped his holding company to the studs, and a permanent ban from serving as an officer of any corporation. The Frost smile did not survive the verdict. I was in the courtroom for that one. I made sure of it. And then there were my parents, their sworn affidavits, the miracle moment, the smile, the take care of Iron Line, little brother, all of it sat in the record next to footage of their son motionless with a tube down his throat at the very hour they described. They were charged with perjury and with filing false statements. Their lawyer called me, then Jenna, then Elena, asking whether I would speak to the prosecutor about leniency for my own aging parents. I thought about the parking garage where Jenna sat for 2 weeks. I thought about the words a fair share. I declined the calls. My mother and father each received 3 years of supervised probation, felony records, and a restitution order for the $500,000 gift, which forced the sale of the house whose mortgage I had paid off as an act of gratitude. I am told they tell people at their new apartment complex that their sons are estranged. Sons, plural. Even now, the accounting between Trevor and me must always come out even. People ask me what it felt like to give my victim impact statement, and I always tell them about the silence. On sentencing day, I stood at a wooden podium in a Denver courtroom, looked across the aisle at my brother in his county jumpsuit, and spoke for 11 minutes without notes. I told the court about the overnight dock at 19, about the box truck with the slipping clutch, about sleeping in the cab through Wyoming winters so a customer would never know we were one breakdown from bankruptcy. I told them about the 300 families whose paychecks depended on the company my brother signed away over a steak lunch. And then I turned to Trevor and I told him the only thing I had left to say. I said that I had spent my whole life believing that if I just built something big enough, our father would finally introduce me the way he introduced him. I said that 14 days of silence had taught me what 38 years of effort never could, that I was never competing against my brother. I was competing against a story our parents wrote before either of us could walk, and no truck, no contract, and no fortune was ever going to edit it. The only thing left to do was close the book. Trevor stared at the table the entire time. My parents, seated 2 rows back, never lifted their eyes. The judge thanked me, the gavel came down, and the book closed. Life since then has been the quietest miracle. I married Jenna on an autumn afternoon with Elena standing on my side of the altar, exactly where she had stood all along. I went back to work with titanium in my skull and clarity in my heart, promoted Elena to president, and gave every employee who held the line during the chaos a piece of the company that loyalty had saved. And 3 years after a forged signature sold Iron Line for $11 million, we rang a bell in New York as the company crossed a public valuation of more than $400 million. Sometimes, late at night, I do the math my family taught me to do. The stake they stole for 1/3 of its worth is now worth more than 10 times what it was the night of the crash. Everything they burned their lives to take, they would have received pieces of for free, eventually, if they had simply been a family. I lay still for 14 days, and in that stillness I finally saw what I could never see standing up. I saw who guarded the door and who sold the keys. I learned that blood tells you nothing about a person except their type, and that the people who truly belong to you are the ones who keep watch while you sleep. But standing where I am today, I have to ask you, was I wrong to refuse mercy for my own elderly parents when one phone call from me might have spared them their felony records? Or do you believe, like I do, that they sentenced themselves the moment they swore to a miracle that a camera proved was a lie? What would you have done waking up in that bed? Let me know in the comments below. And if my story gave you strength, please subscribe and hit the bell icon, because tomorrow I will share another true story of justice that you will not believe.